Good evening and welcome to our very first virtual Halloween celebration. Before we begin, I want to thank our generous donors, Miss Bonnie Becker and Miss Claudia Zitzman, for their support of this program. Tonight, I am taking you on a special journey through Germany and beyond. This is a journey of hauntings and spooks, a collection of stories, legends and myths whose origins are shrouded in mystery and far older than recorded history. They touch upon the human experience, the fear of the unknown, and the desire to explain the unexplainable. For many centuries, Germany was an agricultural society, and people depended on the land. It provided them with everything they needed to survive, but it also gave birth to stories that incorporated supernatural elements and ancient beliefs in otherworldly beings. Whether you believe in the paranormal, are on the fence, or simply enjoy a good tale, you will be in good company tonight as we commence on our ghostly trail. The stories told here represent the lore of a certain city or region, while others are more universal, such as the corn or field demons that are known in every part of the country. One of them is the Oatman, a field spirit that lurks in the corn and kidnaps children. He lives underground, but hunts the fields looking for his next victim. And wherever he sits down, the grain is flattened on all four sides. He wears a broad-brimmed, big black hat, is dressed in a long black cloak, and carries a large stick. As a nature spirit, his powers also influence the weather, and he's particularly fond of thunderstorms. Sometimes he can also be seen prowling around the houses late at night and glaring in through unshuttered windows. If he sees you, death will follow within a year and a day. The best defense against the Oatman is fire, and in some rural regions, people still believe in cleansing their fields with burning oat bundles, sometimes mixed with myrrh, to protect themselves against this demonic entity. Many stories and customs told by our ancestors and passed on from generation to generation have been forgotten, with history fading into the fog of time. Tonight, we will resurrect these tales, and I leave it up to you to make up your own minds. Halloween, celebrated on the 31st of October, has become the day when children turn into goblins and ghouls and gather massive quantities of sweets. But it did not start out as a fun and harmless holiday for youngsters. The origins of Halloween are shrouded in mystery, with some folklorists claiming a connection to the ancient Roman feast of Pomona, the goddess of fruits and seeds, or the festival of the dead called Parentalia. But most historians link it to the Celtic festival of Samhain, which means summer's end in Old Irish. Contrary to popular belief, the Celts were not just located in the British Isles, but had settled large parts of Europe by the 3rd century BC, including France, most of the Iberian Peninsula, Switzerland, southern Germany, Austria, and northern Italy. Samhain was celebrated from the 31st of October through the 1st of November and marked the end of the harvest season and the beginning of winter, or the darker half of the year. It was seen as a liminal time, that is, a time when the threshold or the boundary between this world and the other world became passable. This allowed spirits and fairies to enter our world. The ancient Celts both feared and revered these supernatural beings and placated them with offers of food and drink to ensure that people, livestock and crops would make it through the coming dark winter months. Disguises in the forms of costumes and masks were thought to be essential on a night where supernatural beings were said to be abroad, as this afforded the humans protection by imitating the ghostly visitors. After all, the spirits would not harm one of their own. Even jack-o'-lanterns are rooted in the belief to ward off spirits, and this indispensable part of Halloween, displayed in a carved pumpkin, imitated will-o'-wisps, the ghostly lights that lead wanderers astray. It later merged with the legend of Stingy Jack, who invited the devil to have a drink with him. True to his name, Stingy Jack didn't want to pay for his drink, so he convinced the devil to turn himself into a coin that Jack could use to buy their drinks. Once the devil had done so, Jack decided to keep the money and put it into his pocket next to a silver cross, which prevented the devil from changing back into his original form. Jack eventually freed the devil under the condition that he would not bother Jack for 1 year, and that, should Jack die, he would not claim his soul. The next year, Jack again tricked the devil into climbing into a tree to pick a piece of fruit. While he was up in the tree, Jack carved a sign of the cross into the tree's bark so that the devil could not come down until he promised Jack not to bother him for 10 more years. Soon after, however, Jack died. As the legend goes, God would not allow such an unsavory figure into heaven. The devil, upset by the trick Jack had played on him and keeping his word not to claim his soul, would not allow Jack into hell. So he sent Jack off into the night with only a burning coal to light his way. Jack put the coal into a carved-out turnip, a pumpkin in America, and has been roaming the earth with it ever since. The ghostly figure soon became known as Jack of the Lantern, and then simply Jack-o'-lantern. Fairies and sprites were not the only ones roaming the night according to the ancient Celts. The souls of the dead were also said to revisit their homes, seeking hospitality. Places were set at the dinner table and by the fire to welcome them. The belief that the souls of the dead return home on one night of the year and must be appeased has ancient origins and is found in many cultures throughout the world. The arrival of Christianity did not eliminate these beliefs, but the customs changed to adapt to the new theology. Halloween is the evening before the Christian holy days of All Hallows Day, also known as All Saints or Hallow Mass on 1 November, and All Souls Day on November 2nd, thus giving the holiday on the 31st of October the full name of All Hallows Eve. Since the time of the early church, major feasts in Christianity, such as Christmas, Easter, and Pentecost, had vigils that began the night before, as did the feast of All Hallows. The ringing of church bells for souls in purgatory, the lighting of candles to remember the departed, and prayer vigils replaced the traditional food offerings. But the old belief in something beyond this world never disappeared, and old customs don't die. And when American Halloween customs were brought to Germany some 25 years ago, a return to their roots, some might say, they fell on fertile ground in the ancient land that was once home to the Celts. Our first stop on this journey takes us to the far north of Germany, The North Frisian Islands, located in the North Sea, close to the Danish border, are a popular tourist destination, known for their unspoiled beaches, wind-swept dunes, and incredible wildlife. You'd never expect it to have been the home of a lost city, the Atlantis of the North Sea. The exact location of the settlement of Rungholt is unknown, but locals say that it was swept away by a giant storm tide in January of 1362, more than 650 years ago. Rungholt had been a wealthy port town, inhabited by traders, and amongst the goods they traded was amber from the Baltic region, cattle and agricultural products. Ships were coming in and out daily, ferrying goods from the city to other parts of the world. Merchants sold fresh fish, nets and oysters on the bustling boardwalk, while taverns, street musicians, and inns were abundant downtown, hosting all types of weary travellers, soldiers and traders. Rungholt was a hub for commerce and trade. It is said to have had between 1,000 and 3,000 permanent residents. The port made the city wealthy, and there was enough income, guests and amusement to keep the town lively. Everything was right in the world. This wealth and well-being became the city's downfall, especially as the lifestyle of its occupants became increasingly sinful and disrespectful towards the church. Legend has it that local traders got a pig drunk and called on the local priest to perform last rites. As a punishment for this blasphemous and sacrilegious act, God created a terrible storm and took not only the life of every man, woman and child, but erased the entire town. 25,000 people along the North Sea coast lost their lives that catastrophic night. On the storm's anniversary, when the night is dark, the clouds are low, and the wind blows fiercely across the North Sea, Rungholt emerges from the salty water, and a lonely bell will start ringing. Do not make the mistake of following the call and entering the town, for any mortal foolish enough to set foot on the old roads will disappear beneath the waves when the town sinks into the depths again. One of those North Frisian islands in the North Sea is called Amrum, and it was the home of Hark Olufs. He was born there in 1708 as the son of a merchant marine captain, and in 1721, at the age of just 13, he joined the crew of his father's sailing vessel Hoffnung, or Hope in English. At the time, Amrum was part of Denmark, but his father's ship sailed under the colours of the German city of Hamburg. 3 years later, in 1724, his vessel was seized by Algerian pirates, the so-called Barbary corsairs. Together with 2 of his cousins, he was taken hostage and transported to North Africa. His family could not afford the high ransom price demanded by the Barbary slave traders, and thus he was sold on Algiers' slave market. Hark became the bey, or governor, of Constantine's slave servant. This could have been the end of him, but he was clever and managed to gain the bey's trust. After a few years, he took on the role of treasurer, and in 1728, still only 20 years old, he was made commander of the Life Guards and eventually became the commander-in-chief of the local cavalry. In 1735, he participated in the conquest of Tunis by the Algerian army, and as a reward for his loyal and brave service, he not only received silver and gold, but he was finally released after 11 years of slavery on the 31st of October 1735. He returned to Amrum as a wealthy man, married and founded a family. He never sailed again, but he did hold important official positions on the island. He died on October the 13th, 1754, just 46 years old. But his spirit cannot rest, and he keeps wandering through the dunes. The locals report that some of his treasure is buried in the sand, the exact location known only to him, and it is the hidden gold that ties him to this earth. So if you find yourself in Amrum on a dark and foggy October night, perhaps right about now, be on the lookout. If you encounter a lonely figure in the fog, take heart and talk to this poor lost soul. The reward may be a buried treasure. Our next destination has served as inspiration for many writers, including Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, whose famous protagonist, Dr. Faustus, sells his soul to the devil in exchange for knowledge and partakes in the witches' Sabbath on the Brocken Mountain. Northeast of the old university town of Göttingen, in the border region of Lower Saxony and Saxony-Anhalt, are the Harz Mountains. Their highest peak is the Brocken or Blocksberg. Today, the area is known for winter sports and an idyllic historic botanical garden with mountain plants. But there is a far more sinister side to the mountain. It is the gathering place of witches. For many centuries, the people of the Harz villages have been consumed with witches who use the unusual rock formations named the Devil's Pulpit and the Witch's Altar for their gruesome rituals. The night of April 30th, Walpurgisnacht or St. Walpurga's Night, ironically the patron saint against witchcraft, is a frightful one throughout the region. As night falls, thousands of witches ride their broomsticks from near and far to join the devil in a wild and carnal dance spectacle atop the Brocken before descending with him into the underworld. No local would venture near the mountain on that night, when the smell of sulphur permeates the air and flickering lights from the witches' fires can be seen from the villages. Only the approaching dawn can cast out these evil spectres. Witches and demons are not the only frightful apparitions haunting the fog-shrouded heights, and generations of terrified hikers and early mountaineers have suddenly been confronted with an enormous figure floating in the sky, surrounded by radiating circles of light. The American writer Frank Richard Stockton had this to say: "It must be confessed, it was a fearful sight to behold suddenly upon the summit of a lofty mountain an immense giant, sometimes pointing in a threatening attitude to a village below, as if dooming it to destruction, sometimes with arms upraised, as if invoking ruin upon all the country, and sometimes stalking along with such tremendous strides as to make but one step from peak to peak, often dwarfing himself to nothingness, and again stretching up until his head is in the clouds, then disappearing entirely for a moment, only to reappear more formidable than ever before." There are those who say that the Brocken spectre is only a complicated optical illusion, similar to the Fata Morgana phenomenon, but I leave it up to you to decide if science can explain it or if there are otherworldly forces at work. In the north of the Czech Republic, an area once called Silesia and part of the kingdom of Prussia, lie the giant mountains, a rugged and wild landscape with windswept peaks, dark forests, and clear streams. This is the realm of the giant Rübezahl, the lord of the mountains and the gnomes. He is known as a capricious spirit and a shapeshifter who can change his appearance and will sometimes appear as a benevolent helper, a trickster, or even an avenger. Many centuries ago, an evil nobleman mistreated his villagers and farmers. If he caught them collecting branches in the forest to make a fire, he'd whip them, and those who were caught hunting had to fear for their own lives, as hunting was the nobleman's favourite pastime and sole privilege. Rübezahl knew about the man and his ill reputation, and had already taught him a lesson in the past. But the lesson had been forgotten by the nobleman. One day, the aristocrat organised a great hunt that led him directly into the mountains and into Rübezahl's home. The giant was well aware of this presence and listened to the approaching sound of the horns and the horses' hoofs. Disguised as a simple farmhand, Rübezahl addressed the nobleman and asked him why he was hunting in this territory, telling him that he had no right to be there. The aristocrat blew his horn to gather his huntsmen and lifted his riding crop ready to strike Rübezahl. But the giant told him, "I am the lord and master in this forest, and you cannot treat me like one of your poor farmers." He then glared at the hunters, who were immediately petrified and unable to move or even lift a finger. He told the nobleman that this would be his final hunt, and threw him to the ground with such force that his bones shattered into 1,000 fragments. The nobleman was carried home, but no doctor could help him, and he finally realized that he would have to face his maker. He requested his sword, his silver spurs, and his heraldic shield to make a good impression in the afterlife, and succumbed to his face. He died shortly after. Suddenly there was a knock at the door, and a stranger dressed as a doctor entered the room. He touched the body, which immediately turned to ash, leaving no trace of the finery. It was Rübezahl who had come to teach the vain man and his friends, who had never done a good deed in their lives, a final and impressive lesson. The nobleman is now forgotten, and his castle a ruin. But Rübezahl continues to guard the mountains and punish those who disobey his laws. We now leave the giant mountains and head west to the Rhine River that forms the western border of Germany. The river has been the lifeline for many of the country's oldest cities, predated by Roman fortifications, and is the site of the famous Lorelei, a rock formation that is home to a siren who lures distracted shipmen with her beauty and song, causing them to crash and die on the rocks. It is here that the story of Miss Idyll Dub unfolded. The Middle Rhine Valley, in the western part of Germany between Koblenz and Bingen, is known for its picturesque beauty. The river winds its way through a canyon whose vineyards produce the region's famous Rhine wine. The surrounding hills are dotted with castles and ruins that once proudly overlooked the landscape. In 1851, a Scottish family from Edinburgh was holidaying in Germany and visiting the towns and castles along the river. After a stay in Koblenz, they travelled to Lahnstein and booked themselves into some rooms. The daughter, 17-year-old Adelia Dubb, was a talented artist who very much liked to paint, and she was drawn to the 13th century Castle Larnac, which was partly ruined and stood empty. When she discovered a small wooden staircase, she quickly climbed the rickety steps to capture the view from the tower. But even her weight was too much for the old wooden structure, and it collapsed under her. Adelia managed to save herself by clinging to the ancient stone wall and succeeded in pulling herself up. After the first shock subsided, she realized her predicament. She was trapped. It was too far to jump and impossible to climb down the steep wall. She had no other choice but to wait for help. When her family noticed that Adelia had not returned, a rescue mission was started. The police were informed and a search of the entire area took place. The countryside, the surrounding villages, even the river itself. Only the nearby Larnac Castle was left out of the search. After all, it was a ruin with only broken walls and incomplete stairways to abandoned towers. Poor Adelia waved at the passing ships on the river below her to attract attention, and some of the boatmen even waved back at the pretty girl, but failed to comprehend her dire situation. She pulled out her sketchbook to record her thoughts and always remained hopeful that somebody would find her. The first night passed, and Adelia was by now very thirsty and hungry. The days were warm, but the nights were quite cold. On the next day, she attempted to build stairs from rocks and worked until her hands were bleeding. Alas, without success. She kept writing in her diary and commented that she envied the birds who could simply fly away whilst she was a prisoner. Throughout this ordeal, though, the girl remained optimistic that her family or some passerby would find and rescue her. In her final hours, almost driven crazy by thirst, she determined to leap from the tower, but did not do so. After 4 long days, meticulously recorded in her diary, she died of dehydration. Her despairing family returned to Scotland without news of their daughter's tragic destiny. According to them, she was still missing, and her disappearance an unsolved case. In 1860, the ancient tower of Larnac Castle was to be repaired by the new owner. The first workmen to arrive, however, made a shocking discovery: sun-bleached and rain-soaked human bones, the remains of a straw hat, a dirt-covered gold watch and chain, and later, tucked inside part of the balustrade, the tattered remains of a sketchbook which told of the horrible last lonely days of poor Adelia Dubb. A local newspaper, the Adenauer Kreis- und Wochenblatt, picked up the story and published 2 articles on the 26th of October and the 2nd of November of 1863. Her sketchbook, containing the diary entries, was returned to her family, and a supposed family friend later published them. Adelia did not leave the castle tower alive, and apparently her soul did not leave either. Later visitors, the castle has been privately owned since 1907, with parts of it remaining open to the public, have reported crying and desperate calls for help from the tower. Passers-by and boat passengers have seen the figure of a lonely young woman standing at the top of the tower, forlornly waving a hat. Every attempt to find the distressed girl, who can be heard and seen quite clearly, has been in vain. Adelia's diary ends with the words, "Heavenly Father, have mercy on my soul." Perhaps her wish has now been fulfilled, and she can finally rest in peace? Our next stop on this haunted journey is Baden-Württemberg, specifically the beautiful and majestic hilltop castle Hohenzollern near Stuttgart in the southwest of the country, which is the ancestral seat of Germany's former imperial house of Hohenzollern. The current castle, an impressive fairytale structure with walls, towers and turrets, incorporates the remnants of two much older buildings that date back to the 11th century. It has remained in the family and is still owned by the current head of the Prussian branch, Prince George Frederick of Prussia. Considering the age of the ancient site, it should come as no surprise that a number of hauntings has been recorded. One of the most tragic and dreadful is that of a ghostly noblewoman. The magnificent library of Hohenzollern Castle features a portrait of a white lady. Similar to the Scottish and Irish Banshee, a female spirit in Celtic folklore, her appearance heralds the death of a family member. According to legend, she is the Countess Kunigunde of Weimar-Orlamünde, a young widow who lived in the 14th century. Kunigunde fell in love with Albrecht the Fair, a son of the Burgrave of Nuremberg. He proclaimed that he would marry her if 4 eyes did not stand in the way, referring to his parents who did not approve of the match. Kunigunde tragically mistook his message and thought the eyes referred to her 2 children, a son and a daughter. She stabbed their eyes out with a needle, killing both children in the process. Albrecht, horrified by her actions, refused to marry her. Devastated, she made a pilgrimage to Rome to obtain absolution for her sins from the Pope. As penance, the Pope ordered her to build a monastery and then enter into consecrated life. Some versions state that she was sentenced to life in prison for murder, and others that she died of exhaustion while on the pilgrimage. Her tortured soul now haunts the castle, and woe befalls those who lay eyes on her. We now leave the world of castles behind us and head east again to the old and proud city of Nuremberg in northern Bavaria, the birthplace of famous painter Albrecht Dürer, cartographer Martin Beheim, the inventor of the first globe, and Peter Heinlein, who created the very first watch. The Gothic church of St. Lawrence has been proudly overlooking the former free imperial city of Nuremberg since the year 1250. It is home to such medieval artistic treasures as the Angelic Salutation by Veit Stoss and the monumental Tabernacle by Adam Kraft, which continue to attract both tourists and the faithful. However, locals can tell you that there are other forces afoot as well. There once lived a very pious woman in Nuremberg, a widow who grieved for her late husband until the end of her own life. She attended church on a daily basis and could often be seen leaving her house in the wee hours of the morning to participate in the early morning mass. During the long, dark autumn and winter months, the mass would commence when it was still dark outside. It was on All Souls' Day, the 2nd of November, when she awoke from an unrestful sleep and heard the bells ringing, calling the faithful to church. There were few clouds, a full moon was up in the sky, and it seemed so bright outside that she thought daylight was approaching. She quickly dressed, grabbed her cloak, and hurried to the church. Back then, a large graveyard surrounded the building. Those who attended services had to walk past the many graves. The church doors were wide open, and the Mass had already begun. Many congregants kneeled in the pews. The woman slid into her familiar pew and focused her eyes on the altar. The priest, who was reading Mass, was very familiar, but she couldn't quite place him. When he turned around, though, the blood froze in her veins. It was none other than the old parish priest whom they had buried a few months ago in the graveyard outside. When she turned to her neighbour for reassurance, she realised with a great shock that her neighbour too, and indeed everybody who surrounded her, was dead. There were those who had died only recently and still bore resemblance to their earthly appearance, but also partly or even mostly decomposed bodies whose sight made her shudder with fear and horror. Some she still recognised, as she had known them quite well in life. Immobile with fright at this ghastly realisation, the poor widow didn't know what to do, keep quiet or run. As she sat there, a figure approached her. It was her late godmother who whispered, "May God have mercy. Clara, what are you doing here? Please leave this church at once and don't look around, or it will be your death. You have disturbed the mass of the dead, and if they notice you, they will tear you to pieces." Clara silently nodded assent, got up, and quietly crept to the open door. The dead had bent their heads in prayer, but there seemed to be some noise behind her, a rustling and crawling. She rushed out of the church, heard the bells strike 1 o'clock, and the great door slammed shut behind her with such force that her cloak got stuck. She left it and ran home past the graves as fast as her feet could carry her. She reached her house and collapsed on the stoop, where she was found a few hours later. She had to stay in bed for several days, but as she was a courageous and healthy woman, she eventually recovered. The servant, who had been sent to the church to collect her cloak, reported that it had been shredded, and a piece was located on each grave. Will-o'-the-wisps. Marshes and bogs have always fascinated and frightened people. Germanic tribes viewed them as a border region between the human and the divine world, and human sacrifices to appease the gods were common during the Bronze and Iron Age. Findings of well-preserved bog bodies provided ample food for active imaginations. Furthermore, the swampy ground, combined with frequent fog, made travel dangerous, and those who strayed from the path would sink into a watery grave for all eternity. The German 19th century poet Annette von Droste-Hülshoff captured that fear in her poem The Boy on the Moor. "'Tis an eerie thing over the moor to fare, when the eddies of peat smoke justle, when the wraiths of mist whirl here and there, and wind-blown tendrils tussle, when every step starts a hidden spring, and the trodden moss tufts hiss and sing. 'Tis an eerie thing over the moor to fare, when the tangled reed beds rustle." Northeast of Munich, between the towns of Erding and Freising, is an area called the Erdinger Moos. That area was once wild and very dangerous. It was not until 1800 that local farmers started growing hemp, whose roots helped solidify the swampy soil and began making the land fit for agriculture. Before all this took place, the area was already home to the mysterious and ghostly will-o'-wisps. They are said to be either lost souls, fairies, or even evil spirits. Sometimes they helped exhausted travellers, but often these flickering lights lured disorientated wanderers away from the path and farther into the moor, where they would perish. never to be seen again. Science tells us that these ghostly lights are caused by swamp gas, specifically phosphine, a toxic and flammable substance which is caused by the rotting remains of animals or humans that disappeared in the bog. In the 1850s, Ignaz Stangl, a farmer from Erding, had been to market in Munich. His journey home was delayed, but it was pitch black on this cold and stormy autumn night, with thick clouds that blocked out the moon and a dismal fog that crept up from the swampy depth like ghostly fingers when he was finally homeward bound. The horses knew the way, so Ignaz snoozed on his cart as they entered the moor. However, suddenly, the horses, whose keen senses had alerted them that all was not right, stopped dead with a frightened neighing, and Ignaz jerked awake. In front of him, in the middle of the path, were 3 ghostly lights that turned brighter and brighter. Ignaz covered his eyes, almost blinded by the glare. When he took another peek, he saw 3 ladies in flowing white dresses who beckoned him to follow them, and he felt himself pulled out of his seat. Fortunately, his horses had more sense. They reared up, throwing him back into the cart, and galloped away like the devil himself was on their heels. When Ignaz looked back, the white ladies had disappeared. He fell into a swoon and arrived home more dead than alive. For several days he suffered from a terrible fever and hallucinations, shouting in fear that something was coming for him, and when he finally came to, he swore that he had seen the fairies who wanted to take him to their otherworldly realm. Our next story takes us to the Alpine region of Bavaria and Austria, the remote mountain villages where many of the old beliefs are alive and people cling to the customs of their forebears. This is the area of the Wild Hunt. The period between Christmas Eve and the Feast of Epiphany is one of the darkest times of the year, when the nights are long and daylight is scarce. We know this as Twelfth Night. It's the mystical time between the years when everything seems possible, and the veil between this world and the netherworld is thinnest. Ghosts, ghouls, and other supernatural beings roam the countryside. Dreams and rituals foretell the future, and at midnight, animals can speak the human tongue. But be warned, those who hear them will soon die. In many parts of Germany and Austria, these dark nights are the time of the wild hunt or the wild chase. The old Germanic god Odin, seated on a huge white horse with fiery eyes, leads a fearsome group of hunters through the night sky. They are accompanied by a pack of ghostly dogs and wolves, ravens, and the souls of those who died an unnatural death and cannot rest. The people in the Alpine villages of Bavaria and Austria would take all kinds of precautions to ensure their safety from the hellish riders, which included taking down all laundry to prevent the ghostly fiends from getting entangled in a freshly washed sheet, locking up their animals, and blessing the house and stables so they couldn't be stolen away. Those unlucky enough to encounter the riders may not live to tell the tale unless they can quickly throw themselves on the ground and cover their eyes. A fiddler in the Austrian town of Ischl was on his way home one cold and snowy New Year's Eve, after having played for a group of merry guests earlier that evening. Suddenly, he heard a terrible noise behind him, and before he could do anything, he had been picked up by invisible arms and was carried away to a high mountain top. He closed his eyes and was certain that he would not make it home long. The ferocious howling tempted him to take a peek, but he kept his eyes firmly shut, and finally morning came and the spooks were gone. He climbed down from the mountain and reached town, where he collapsed from exhaustion. He never spoke about his ordeal, but his hair had turned white overnight, and nobody would ever hear him laugh again. The year was 1678, Christmas in Vienna, Austria. The old priest of St. Stephen's Cathedral sat awake with a glass of wine after having celebrated midnight mass on Christmas Eve. That day, he had discovered an ancient book in the church's library. The letters were faded, the paper was fragile, but the old priest loved such books. It told a warning tale about ghostly and prophetic sightings in the church, and the priest shook his head, laughing at such superstition. After all, this was the age of reason. He'd been in the magnificent old cathedral many times, including late at night, and had never encountered worshippers in burial shrouds or some such nonsense. He put the book aside, finished up his wine, and decided to go to bed. On his way to his bedchamber, he looked out the window and realized that it had started to snow. Thick white flurries were falling from the sky and covering the surroundings in a perfect white blanket. He glanced at the cathedral and could barely believe his eyes. There were flickering lights in the sanctuary. Perhaps an illusion? No. He squinted his eyes and looked again, and the lights were still there. He feared the presence of intruders who were after the cathedral's treasures, grabbed his coat and a heavy silver candelabra. There was no time to call for help, no time to waste, as a matter of fact, and so he reached for the church's keys and crossed the graveyard that still surrounded the church at this time. He took the key, muttered a short prayer, drew a deep breath, and opened a small side portal. Inside the cathedral were people and lights, but these were not intruders. A mass was being celebrated, and the church was full to bursting. The priest shuddered as his eyes wandered over the assembled crowd. He recognized some of them. Over there was the shoemaker Hans, and next to him the baker with his young pregnant wife Flora. The old council member, a very distinguished gentleman, was also present. What were they doing here at this hour? And why were they not reacting to his presence? And most of all, why were they all dressed in plain white burial shrouds? Was this some trick? Some prank? Fear struck him, and he fell to his knees, dropping the candelabra as he turned to the altar to look at the priest. He saw himself celebrating a mass for the dead. Suddenly, the clock struck 3 o'clock, and the church was empty and dark. The priest stumbled back to his rooms, took out his diary, and wrote down what he had experienced. 1 year later, in 1679, it was Christmas again, but there were no celebrations in Vienna. It was the year of the Great Plague, which had already claimed thousands of lives, including the shoemaker, the baker, Flora, the council member, and the priest who recorded it all. Should you find yourself in Vienna St. Stephen's Cathedral for midnight mass, don't linger too long, for you may not like what you'll see. Our last story tonight takes us back to the northern part of Germany. In the year 9 AD, a terrible and bloody battle took place in the Teutoburg forest, a range of low hills in what is today Lower Saxony and North Rhine-Westphalia. It became known as the Clades Variana, or Varian disaster. The exact location of this battle is unknown, but recent archaeological research points to an area called Kalkriese, some 20 kilometers north of Osnabrück. The area had been invaded some 20 years earlier, that is in the year 10 BC, and subjected to repeated attempts by Roman forces to create a province east of the Rhine River. But all this ended when an alliance of Germanic tribes, under the leadership of chieftain Arminius, who had spent his youth in Rome as a hostage and had received military training there, ambushed and destroyed 3 Roman legions and their auxiliaries under the command of the Roman general Varus. Arminius used his knowledge of Roman military tactics to his advantage, and the Romans experienced a disastrous defeat, with casualties ranging between 15,000 and 20,000 legionnaires. Many of the officers committed suicide, others were enslaved, and only a few hundred defeated soldiers managed to escape. In the 1970s, on a brisk autumn evening, a young electrician worked in the church of St. Agatha in Mettingen, west of Osnabrück, to fix a very persistent problem with the electric wiring. It was a Friday evening and it was already getting dark outside. He just wanted to be done, perhaps enjoy a glass of beer and a nice supper, and not crawl around in the cobweb-covered basement of a church. He stretched his back and went upstairs in the sanctuary to check the lights and to test if his repairs were successful. That's when he heard a strange noise, something like a horn, coming from far away. He opened one of the side doors and listened to the unusual sound that at first was quiet, but then got louder and closer. Despite straining his eyes, he couldn't see anything at all out of the ordinary, so he shrugged his shoulders and turned back to his work for one final checkup. Just as he was about to flip another switch, he saw the figure of a Roman soldier on horseback emerging from the wall, followed by a small group of armed legionnaires on foot. They moved slowly and in absolute silence. They seemed exhausted, and some appeared to be wounded. They all looked quite solid, but when they reached the opposite wall, they marched straight through it as if the barrier didn't exist for them at all. The poor electrician, who had watched this ghostly spectacle frozen in place, ran out of the church, jumped into his car, and drove home at top speed. He called his boss, and together they returned to the church to retrieve his equipment, but the young man absolutely refused to set foot inside the building. Were these the defeated remnants of Varus's army who were withdrawing to their garrisons in the west? Or had they fought some other battle? We shall never know, but what is known is that Mettingen is on an old Roman road, and perhaps the legionnaires are forever marching, seeking to reach safety and a place to rest.